And that brings us to fermentation, which some organisms use when oxygen is not available if they aren't able to use a different final electron acceptor. So, um, like I said, there are anaerobic organisms that use anaerobic respiration, glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. There are aerobic organisms that use aerobic respiration, which also is glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. They can't switch back and forth. But aerobic organisms can switch to fermentation in the absence of oxygen. So fermentation is anaerobic, but it is not respiration. Different steps, okay? And yes, aerobic organisms can switch back and forth between aerobic respiration and fermentation. Many of them that can anyway. Actually, most, and even you can, right? So both start with glycolysis, which ends with pyruvic acid or pyruvate, but that's where they diverge. So if oxygen's available, the pyruvate goes through Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. If there's no oxygen, it goes through fermentation. All right. So a microbe cannot switch between different types of respiration. They either have an anaerobic or aerobic electron transport chain. But some aerobic microbes can also perform fermentation when in the absence of oxygen. Yeast is an example. You are an example. You're not a microbe, but you're an example of something you can switch back and forth. So in respiration, final electron acceptors are molecular oxygen or oxygen-containing salts. Both are inorganic compound acceptors, right? Final electron acceptors in fermentation would be organic compounds like NAD+, which you've seen before. In respiration, you have the complete oxidation of sugar. In fermentation, you do not have a complete oxidation of sugar. Respiration yields a huge amount of ATP. Fermentation yields very, very little ATP. It's not great. But fermentation provides some important byproducts like acids, gases, alcohols. All right, so fermentation overall has two steps, the glycolysis step and then the actual fermentation step. Okay, so fermentation always follows glycolysis. So glycolysis, as you know, it's just the same as we studied before, really generates 2 ATP net, 2 ATP in, 4 ATP out for a net gain of 2 ATP. Also, 2 NAD pluses are converted into 2 NADHs because they pick up electrons, strip high energy electrons from glucose. But the electron transport chain has shut down because there's no oxygen, right? We talked about why that happens. Also, citric acid cycle will shut down in the absence of oxygen because all those NADHs have nowhere to let go of their electrons, so they can't get converted back into NAD+, so they can't drive the citric acid cycle. So citric acid cycle is now shut down as well in the absence of oxygen. So what a lot of cells will do to try to keep moving forward with energy production, even though most energy producing processes have shut down, is fermentation. Fermentation does not generate any ATP, right? This is not an energy producing step. The fermentation step merely recycles NADH back into NAD+ so that glycolysis can continue, right? Because in the citric acid cycle, when oxygen was going, all the NAD+ was getting converted to NADH, but if the electron transport chain is backed up, the NADH can't pass off its electrons to the electron transport chain. It can't go back to NAD+. It can't go and pick up more electrons from the citric acid cycle or the glycolysis step. So for glycolysis, for these at least 2 ATP to be generated per glucose, to keep glycolysis running, you have to have this fermentation step. And in the fermentation step, no energy is converted to ATP, but the NAD+ is recycled. NADH is recycled back to NAD+ to keep glycolysis going. So let's look at a diagram of this. So here you have the glycolysis step. We've seen it before. This is oversimplified. You start with glucose, you end with 2-pyruvate. Pyruvate's a 3-carbon molecule, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. 6 carbons strung together for glucose, 2 different strings of 3 carbons for the end products for pyruvate. You put in 2 ATP and got 4 ATP out for a net gain of 2 ATP. So you generated a little bit of energy for the cell. And in this process, some electrons were stripped. Two NAD pluses were loaded up with high energy electrons, NADH. Now, if oxygen were available and the electron transport chain were running, these NADHs would unload their electrons in the electron transport chain and come back for more. They'd be converted back to NAD plus and come back for more. But electron transport chains shut down, can't do that. So instead it goes through, the pyruvate goes through fermentation, where those electrons are given back. So the electrons carried by NADH are given back to pyruvate, recycled back to NAD+, they can keep glycolysis going. Pyruvate in this process is converted in this version of fermentation to lactate. Now there's a lot of different types of fermentation. This is lactate or lactic acid fermentation. Okay? This is what's performed by your cells in your body. So when and you've experienced this happening. So when you lift weights, and you get that burning sensation in your muscles that hurts so much that it makes it feel like you can't lift the weight one more time, that's because you've been working those muscles so hard that they've burned through all the oxygen, and there's a small area of a small anaerobic area. There's no oxygen available anymore because you've been burning through it so quickly. And so those muscle cells, in an attempt to continue generating at least some energy, at least 2 ATP per glucose, they've reverted to fermentation, to lactic acid fermentation. And lactate or lactic acid is the waste product. It starts building up in those muscle cells, and that creates that burning sensation. It's okay that that happens. As soon as you put down the weights, the lactic acid will get metabolized. It'll go through the citric acid cycle and get oxidized into carbon dioxide, and it'll be removed very quickly from your body. So it's not a big deal. So, and I'm not talking about muscles being sore the next day. I'm talking about in the moment. But that's what that burning sensation is. Now, 2 ATP per glucose versus if you had the electron transport chain, a total of like 36 ATP per glucose, that's pretty sorry, right? It's a last ditch effort to keep going a little bit. If you were suffocating, your whole body would start burning like those muscles when you lift weights. And that means that all the cells in your body are reverting to fermentation in a last-ditch effort to keep you alive. But 2 ATP per glucose is just not enough to drive the processes of this huge body that is you. Fermentation is crap, right? It's not efficient way of extracting energy from food, and you cannot, as a large multicellular organism, you can't survive on it. That's the benefit of aerobic respiration. As soon as aerobic respiration evolved, multicellular life just took off on this planet because it's so efficient. And with that efficient energy conversion process, you can drive the production of really complex structures like animals, plants, fungi, things like that. Now this is microbiology. So a microbe that uses lactic acid fermentation would be lactobacilli. They're a probiotic. They're what makes yogurt. Lactobacilli ferment milk sugars especially, but they can ferment other sugars too, and their byproduct is lactic acid. That lactic acid is what makes yogurt sour. So if you get unflavored yogurt, just plain yogurt in the store, you'll notice it's quite sour, and that's because of the lactic acid buildup, and that's what preserves the yogurt. Another place you find lactobacilli is in sourdough culture. So sourdough culture is, you can make it at home. You just leave some, if you leave flour and water out long enough, you freshen it up with fresh flour and water every couple days. This gross culture of some strange mix of microbes will colonize, but eventually, after a couple of weeks, it will stabilize into a culture that's a mix of yeast and lactobacilli. And the two work together to make sourdough bread. And that's why sourdough bread is sour, is because of this lactic acid buildup in the bread as the byproduct of lactobacilli fermentation. Another kind of fermentation that you're probably familiar with is alcohol fermentation, and it's basically the same thing. You have glycolysis, where you generate 2 ATP, 2 NAD+, get loaded up with electrons to make 2 NADH. You make those 2 pyruvate, but now this NADH, they have nowhere to go because the electron transport chain has shut down in the absence of oxygen, and so they just fermentation kicks in, to recycle those NADH back to NAD plus to keep glycolysis going. No further ATP is produced. But in this process, these steps that are obscured here, that we're not going into, they're slightly different than in lactic acid fermentation. And so the byproduct is actually ethanol here. So you get, a little carbon dioxide released and some ethanol. Ethanol is a 2-carbon alcohol. And we love this kind of fermentation. So it makes beer and wine and other alcohols for you. All right. Now, I want to mention, so yeast yeast do this, right? Yeast do alcohol fermentation. Um, and but they only do it in the absence of oxygen because it sucks, right? It's 2 ATP per glucose. That's so little ATP. If yeast have oxygen, they're going to use aerobic respiration because it's so much better. Yeast can do both, right? They can use aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen, or they can ferment in the absence. So if you want to make some beer, that's why you have to cut off the oxygen supply, because with oxygen, there's not going to be any ethanol fermentation. They're going to use aerobic respiration, just get rid of all the carbon and the glucose as carbon dioxide. They're not going to convert it into ethanol because this process is crap for them. They can't grow very fast that way. So when they are in the absence of oxygen, they can live because they are single-celled organisms. They're very simple. They have to slow their metabolism way, way down. They have much slower growth, but the byproduct is something that we like. Now, there are many other types of fermentation with other kinds of byproducts. But these are two that you'd probably be most familiar with. I'm going to squeeze photosynthesis in here because some again, this doesn't have to do with the microbes in your body, but it's very important to your life on this planet, right? So this is the equation for respiration. This is not a balanced equation, but this is what you have. You have sugars. You eat some sugars, you breathe in oxygen. These molecules rearrange into carbon dioxide waste, water, which is technically a waste product, but it's not like a bad one, and then energy in the form of ATP and heat. This is what this is the purpose of respiration. Photosynthesis is the exact same thing, but with the arrow flipped. Exact same equation, the arrow flipped the other way. The starting products of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. Now these get rearranged into sugar, which is the main purpose. Oxygen is the waste product of photosynthesis. Isn't that cool? So one man's trash is another man's treasure, right? The waste for photosynthesis is the substrate for respiration. The waste of respiration is the substrate of photosynthesis. So photosynthesizing creatures and respiring creatures balance each other in this way. We just recycle the same elements back and forth, carbon dioxide to sugar, right? Now, the thing is with photosynthesis is carbon dioxide and water are very, very low energy stable molecules. So you have to invest some energy to rearrange these molecules into a high energy molecule like sugar. And that energy comes from the sun. So in respiration, the energy that was released got packed into ATP and heat. And the ATP might be used to move or build more molecules or whatever. But ATP and heat, that's what you get out. In photosynthesis, the energy going in is from the sun, right? Because we said photons have a lot of energy in the form of kinetic energy because they're moving so fast. So plants, cyanobacteria, algae, they can harness the energy in sunlight and use it to rearrange these low energy molecules, carbon dioxide and water, to make high energy molecules, sugar. Oxygen is the waste product. Now, why would an organism do this? Why would an organism build sugar? Well, part of it is to build cell parts, but also this sugar is a battery. It's an energy battery. The energy in the sun is stored in this sugar molecule for later because at some point the sun's going to go down. And if, so the plant or the cyanobacteria or the algae, they could just use this energy and convert it into ATP. They could just do that. But the problem is that the sun goes down for 12 hours approximately per day, like on average, right? It varies a little bit from season to season, from different parts of the planet, whatever. But on average, 12 hours a day, there's no sunlight. Well, that would cause all those photosynthesizing creatures to die every time night came. And that would be no good because the ATP, they'd burn through it in a few minutes or maybe a couple hours, and then they'd die. So what these photosynthesizing creatures do is they photosynthesize during the day, and what they do is they take this energy, and instead of making ATP with it, they don't stop there. They generate sugar, and the sugar is a way to store that energy from the sun. So energy from the sun gets stored as sugar. And then the night comes, and those photosynthesizing organisms, cyanobacteria, algae, plants, respire during the night. They take that sugar, they extract the energy from it in aerobic respiration, and release the ATP to do cell work. So photosynthesizing creatures use both. They use photosynthesis to capture the sun's energy and store it as sugar, and then they burn that sugar to generate ATP to do the work of the cell, the activities of the cell. Okay. So that's why we call photosynthesizing creatures autotrophs. They make their own sugars to use for respiration. And that's why we are called heterotrophs. We're other eaters, not self-eaters. We're other eaters because we're eating that sun energy in the form of sugar too, but we're not making it ourselves. We're mooching off the plants. The plants did all the work. The plants and the cyanobacteria and the algae, they took the sun's energy and converted it into sugars to store it for later, and then we went and stole it when we eat it, right? We're eating it ourselves and extracting the energy from it. So essentially all the energy on this planet in every food chain originates from the sun. So if you were really, we talked about the different energy transformations in aerobic respiration alone, but if you're thinking about energy transformations that sustain life on this planet, it starts with the sun. You are always eating the sun. Plants change the energy in the sun to sugars. We eat the plants, or maybe a cow eats the plants and converts that energy into cow meat, and then we eat the cow. But ultimately, all the energy on this planet comes from the sun, except for very rare cases, and that's hydrothermal vents in the deep sea. But by and large, the vast majority of every ecosystem on this planet, it's all sun energy driving life on this planet.